I was on my knees scrubbing a floor that wasn't mine to scrub when I heard her say the words that would end everything I thought I knew about my marriage. You will do exactly what I say, or I will make sure you lose everything, including him. I didn't know my husband was standing in the hallway behind her. I didn't know that in the next 60 seconds, a secret his family had buried for 15 years was about to crawl out into the light. And once it did, none of us would survive as the same people. My name is Kareen. I married into a family that smiled at church and lied at home. I thought I understood my mother-in-law. I understood nothing. This is the day the truth stopped hiding. Before I tell you what happened in that hallway, you need to understand what my life had become in the 8 months leading up to it, because none of it happened overnight. Betrayal like this doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, one small humiliation at a time, until you look up one day and realize you have been shrinking yourself to fit inside somebody else's cruelty. I married Malcolm 3 years ago. He was the kind of man who remembered how I took my coffee, who called his mother every Sunday out of love rather than obligation, who cried at our wedding in front of 150 people and didn't care who saw. I fell in love with a man who was gentle in a world that had not been gentle with him. What I did not understand, not fully, not until it was too late, was that gentleness toward his mother and blindness toward her true nature were the same coin, just two different faces. His mother's name was Odessa. When she first met me, she held my hands in both of hers and told me I had good bones for hard work. I thought it was a compliment about my health. I did not yet know that Odessa Whitfield did not compliment women. She measured them. She was deciding, in that very first handshake, exactly how much use I would be to her. The trouble started small, the way trouble in families like ours always does. 6 months after Malcolm and I were married, Odessa's apartment building was sold, and she needed somewhere to stay just for a little while, she said, just until I find my footing. Malcolm, being Malcolm, opened our home without a second thought. I didn't argue. How could I argue with taking care of an aging mother? I had been raised to believe that family takes family in, no questions asked. I welcomed her with a made-up guest room and a home-cooked meal the night she arrived. 2 weeks became 2 months. 2 months became what I now understood would be forever, because Odessa Whitfield had no intention of ever finding her footing anywhere else. She had found exactly where she wanted to be. At first, it was subtle. She would ask me to refill her tea while she sat and watched television, phrasing it as a favor between family. I didn't mind. Then it became expected. Then it became demanded. Within 3 months, I was cooking 3 meals a day for a woman who criticized every dish I placed in front of her. Cleaning a house that somehow always needed cleaning again, 5 minutes after I finished, and doing her laundry separately from mine and Malcolm's, because she said she didn't trust my washing methods with her good clothes. Malcolm worked long shifts at the hospital where he was a physical therapist, 12-hour days that left him exhausted by the time he got home. Odessa was careful, almost surgical, about when she let her true self show. In front of Malcolm, she was warm. She called me baby and complimented my cooking and told her son what a lucky man he was. The moment his car left the driveway in the morning, the mask came off like a coat she'd been eager to shed. You think because you have a ring on your finger, you don't have to work, she told me one afternoon, standing in my kitchen with her arms crossed while I washed dishes that were not mine. In my day, a wife earned her place in a household. What have you earned here besides my son's paycheck? I said nothing. That was the rule I had made for myself, the survival strategy I'd built brick by brick. Say nothing, keep the peace, let it roll off, because Malcolm loved his mother and I loved Malcolm, and I told myself that loving him meant absorbing whatever came with her. But absorbing cruelty does not make it disappear. It only teaches the person delivering it that there is no ceiling to how far they can go. By month 5, Odessa had stopped asking me to do things and started simply informing me. She would leave lists on the counter: laundry, groceries, dishes, ironing, written in her looping cursive handwriting, addressed to no one because she didn't need to address them. We both knew who they were for. She started referring to me, in front of her friends from church who visited on Wednesday afternoons, as the help. She said it with a laugh each time, like it was a joke, but jokes repeated 50 times stop being jokes. They become the truth someone is trying to make real by saying it enough. I brought it up to Malcolm exactly twice. The first time he laughed it off, told me his mother had a sharp sense of humor, and that I shouldn't take her too seriously. The second time, 3 months in, I was more direct. I told him I felt disrespected in my own home. He got quiet, rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when he didn't want to have a hard conversation, and said, "She's getting older, Kareen. She's dealing with a lot." Can you just be patient with her a little longer, for me? For me, two words that had always worked on me before, and worked on me again that day, even though something in my chest told me I was making a mistake by staying quiet. I want to be honest about something, because this story only makes sense if I am honest about it. Part of me stayed silent not just because I loved Malcolm, but because I was afraid. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, I would become the villain of my own marriage. The wife who couldn't get along with her husband's mother, the wife who caused division in a family. Odessa was skilled at making sure that if anyone ever raised their voice, it would be me, and I would be the one who looked unreasonable. She never yelled, she never lost her temper where anyone could see. Her cruelty was quiet, precise, and always delivered with a smile that made it impossible to prove to anyone who wasn't standing there. There was a night, sometime around month 6, when I tried a different approach. Instead of confronting Odessa directly, I tried to build a bridge with her, thinking that maybe the coldness between us came from her feeling like an outsider in a home she didn't choose to depend on. I made her favorite dish, a smothered oxtail recipe I'd asked my own grandmother to walk me through over the phone, and I set the table with the good dishes, the ones we only brought out for holidays. I wanted her to feel welcomed, truly welcomed, not just tolerated. She ate in near silence, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't gratitude. "You're trying too hard," she said, not looking up from her plate. "Women who have nothing to prove don't need to prove anything." I sat there holding my fork, unsure whether I'd just been complimented or gutted, and by the time I replayed the sentence in my head 3 times, I understood it was the second one. That was Odessa's particular gift. She could hurt you and leave you second guessing whether you'd even been hurt at all. I stopped trying to build bridges after that night. I built walls instead, small emotional ones, just enough to survive each day without absorbing every barb she threw. I went to work, I came home, I did what needed to be done, and I stopped expecting warmth from a woman who had decided long before I arrived that warmth was a currency she wasn't willing to spend on me. By month 7, she had started controlling money in ways I didn't fully understand yet. She asked Malcolm for help here and there, small amounts at first, $200 for a medical bill, $300 for a car repair. Malcolm, dutiful son that he was, gave without asking many questions. I noticed the pattern before he did, the way the requests were becoming more frequent, more specific, and always timed for days when Malcolm was too tired from work to look closely at anything. Once I saw her on the phone in the backyard, pacing back and forth along the fence line with her voice low and clipped in a way I'd never heard her use before. When I stepped outside to ask if everything was all right, she ended the call so fast the phone nearly slipped from her hand, and she told me too quickly that it was nothing, just an old friend. I remember thinking, even then, that old friends don't make people's hands shake. I didn't know yet what all of it was for. I only knew that something didn't add up, the way a room feels wrong before you can name what's out of place in it. I started keeping a small mental log, not because I suspected anything as big as what I would eventually learn, but because 8 months of small inconsistencies teach a woman to pay attention, even when she doesn't yet know what she's paying attention to. Then came the day everything cracked open. It was a Tuesday. Malcolm's schedule had changed that week. A colleague had asked to swap shifts, and instead of coming home at 7 in the evening the way he normally did, he was due to arrive around 1 in the afternoon. He didn't tell me. He wanted to surprise me, he said later, bring home lunch and spend a rare quiet afternoon together before his mother got back from her Bible study group. Except Odessa hadn't gone to Bible study that day. She'd stayed home, and she'd used the house she thought was empty except for me, to say the things she never would have said with her son in earshot. I was on the kitchen floor, on my knees, scrubbing a stain that had been there for 2 days because I hadn't had a spare hour to deal with it, when she walked in and started in on me. It began the way it always did, with a complaint about the state of the house, but it escalated faster than it ever had before. She told me I was lazy. She told me I contributed nothing to this household that she and Malcolm didn't provide. And then, when I finally said something back, when I told her, my voice shaking, that I worked a full-time job of my own and that this was my house too, my name was on the deed too, she said the words that changed everything. "You will do exactly what I say, or I will make sure you lose everything, including him. You don't know what I know. You don't know what your husband doesn't know. One phone call, Kareen, and this marriage is over, and you'll have nothing to show for these 3 years but a suitcase." I froze, not because I understood what she meant, because I didn't, and the not knowing terrified me more than any insult she'd ever thrown at me. What did she know? What was she threatening me with? That's when I heard the front door. Malcolm had come home early to surprise me with lunch, and instead he'd walked into the middle of a threat aimed at his wife by his own mother. I don't know how long he'd been standing in that hallway before either of us noticed him. Long enough, it turned out, to hear the threat itself, word for word. Long enough that when Odessa finally turned and saw him there, the color drained from her face so fast it was like watching a woman age 10 years in 1 second. Malcolm, she said, and for the first time in 3 years, I heard something in her voice that wasn't command. It was fear. He didn't yell. That surprised me almost as much as the threat itself had. Malcolm, my gentle husband who avoided conflict the way other people avoid touching a hot stove, walked into that kitchen with a stillness that felt more dangerous than any shouting could have been. "What do you know," he said, "that I don't know?" Odessa tried to backpedal, tried to say it was just an expression, that mothers and daughters in law sometimes had tension and it meant nothing. But Malcolm had heard enough of the sentence to know it wasn't nothing, and for the first time in his life, he didn't let his mother's discomfort end the conversation. "Mama," he said, quieter now, and somehow that quiet was worse than any volume, "you don't threaten someone with information unless the information is real. What is it?" The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. I remember counting my own heartbeat during it because I genuinely did not know what was coming, and some part of me, God forgive me, wondered if it was going to be about me. Some past mistake, some part of my own life I hadn't told him, that she'd somehow dug up to hold over my head. It wasn't about me at all. Odessa sat down slowly at the kitchen table, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost all its command. It sounded, for the first time since I'd known her, like the voice of someone very old and very tired of carrying something heavy. 15 years ago, she said, your father didn't die the way I told you he did. Malcolm's father, James Whitfield, no, I need to be careful here, I'm using a placeholder, let me just say his father, had passed away when Malcolm was 19, in what the family had always described as a sudden heart attack. It was the origin story of so much of who Malcolm was. The reason he'd gone into medicine, the reason he worked himself to exhaustion trying to help other families avoid the kind of sudden loss his own family had suffered. It was sacred ground in our marriage. We didn't joke about it, we barely discussed it, because it still visibly hurt him too. And now his mother was sitting in my kitchen telling him that the story he'd carried for 15 years, the story that had shaped the entire architecture of his adult life, was a lie. His father hadn't died of a sudden heart attack. He had died after a long illness that Odessa had hidden from her own children, because the illness was connected to a period of his life she was ashamed of, a period involving another woman, another family, in another state that he had been quietly supporting for years before Malcolm was ever born. When he died, there had been a will, an actual will, that left a portion of his estate not to Odessa and her children, but to that other family. Odessa had spent 15 years and, as it turned out, a significant amount of money making sure that will was buried, contested into oblivion, and never spoken of again. The medical bills and car repairs she'd been asking Malcolm for over the past several months hadn't been for herself at all. They were payments to a lawyer who had recently reopened contact with her, a man representing the other family, who had found new documentation and was threatening to expose the truth publicly if she didn't settle. She had been trying to buy silence with her son's money without ever telling him what the money was for. And when I, unknowingly, had started asking harder questions about where the household finances were going, questions that might eventually reach Malcolm, she had panicked. The threat she made to me wasn't really about me being lazy or ungrateful. It was about controlling the one person in the house who might unravel a 15-year secret before she was ready for it to unravel. She needed me compliant and quiet, because a compliant, quiet daughter-in-law wouldn't ask where the money was going. I sat on that kitchen floor and watched my husband's entire understanding of his childhood rearrange itself in real time. I watched him realize that his mother's harshness toward me for 8 months hadn't been about tradition or old-fashioned values at all. It had been about control, about making sure nothing and no one in that house threatened the wall of lies she'd built around herself. Malcolm didn't scream, he didn't throw anything. He did something that I think frightened Odessa far more than rage would have. He sat down across from her, looked her directly in the eyes, and asked her calmly to tell him everything from the beginning and to understand that if she left out one detail, he would find it out from someone else, and that would be so much worse for her. She told him everything about the other woman, about the other family, A half-sister Malcolm never knew he had, living 2 states away, who had spent 15 years wondering why her father's other family had erased her existence. About the will, about the lawyer, about the money she'd been quietly siphoning from her own son under a mountain of small manufactured emergencies. I remember the exact way the kitchen looked in the minutes after she finished speaking. The afternoon light was slanting through the window over the sink the way it always did around 1 o'clock, warm and gold, and completely indifferent to what had just happened underneath it. Malcolm sat with his hands flat on the table, staring at them like he was checking whether they were still his own. I didn't move from the floor for a long time. My knees ached from kneeling, but I was more afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing was happening between mother and son than I was of the discomfort in my own body. Odessa reached across the table at one point like she meant to take Malcolm's hand, and he pulled it back before she made contact. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cruel, it was just final, the kind of small motion that says more than a raised voice ever could. I need you to leave the kitchen, he told her, quiet and even. Both of us need some air that doesn't have you in it right now. She left without another word, and for the first time in 8 months, I heard her bedroom door close behind her instead of a lecture trailing out from it. I won't pretend the next several weeks were simple, because grief and betrayal that size don't resolve in an afternoon. Malcolm needed time. He needed to grieve a father he thought he understood and didn't, and he needed to sit with the fact that the mother who raised him had let him grieve the wrong version of that loss for 15 years to protect her own reputation. There were nights he barely spoke. There were nights he apologized to me over and over for not seeing what had been happening in our own home for the better part of a year, even though none of it had ever been his fault. What changed and changed permanently was the balance of our household. Odessa did not get to stay. Malcolm made that decision himself, without me having to ask, without me having to justify 8 months of quiet suffering that I had never fully put into words for him, because I hadn't wanted to be the wife who caused problems. He told her she needed to find her own place, effective immediately, and that whatever relationship they rebuilt from that point forward would have to be built on total honesty or not built at all. He also did something I hadn't expected. He reached out to his half-sister. Her name doesn't matter for this story, only that she existed, that she was real, that she had been erased from a family she had every right to be part of, and that Malcolm decided, on his own, with no pressure from me, that 15 years of silence was 15 years too many. They spoke for the first time on a phone call that lasted almost 4 hours. I sat in the next room and cried listening to the muffled sound of my husband, finally getting to know a sister he never knew he had, born out of a truth that had nearly cost him his marriage to bring to light. As for the money Odessa had taken under false pretenses, Malcolm didn't pursue legal action against his own mother, though I know part of him wanted to. What he did instead was require full transparency. Every account, every transaction, laid bare, so there would never again be a hidden thread he couldn't see. It wasn't revenge, it was armor. He had learned, at 34 years old, that the people who are supposed to protect you can also be the ones you need protection from, and he wasn't going to let that happen inside his own marriage again. I think about that day in the kitchen more than I'd like to admit, not because of the threat itself, though I still remember exactly how her voice sounded when she said I would lose everything, but because of what came after it. Because sometimes the worst moment of your life is also the moment truth finally gets a chance to breathe. If Malcolm hadn't come home early that day, if he hadn't been standing in that hallway at exactly the wrong, exactly right moment, I don't know how much longer I would have stayed silent. How much longer Odessa would have kept bleeding her own son dry to protect a secret that was never hers to protect in the first place. What I learned from those 8 months, and from that one unbearable afternoon, is that silence given out of love can become its own kind of harm. I loved Malcolm enough to absorb his mother's cruelty rather than risk conflict between them. But real love, the kind that actually protects a marriage, isn't the love that stays quiet to keep the peace. It's the love that tells the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient, even when it might make you look difficult, even when you're afraid of being the one blamed for breaking something that was already broken long before you arrived. Odessa and Malcolm are rebuilding something now, slower and more honest than what they had before. I've forgiven her mostly, though forgiveness didn't come with amnesia. I remember every single one of those 8 months, and I don't let anyone in my house speak to me the way she once did, family or otherwise. My marriage is stronger now than it was before that Tuesday, not despite what happened in that kitchen, but because of it. Malcolm and I don't hide hard conversations from each other anymore. We learned the cost of hiding them the day his mother's 15-year secret spilled out onto our kitchen floor. If you're sitting somewhere right now absorbing silence the way I did, staying quiet to keep a family peace that was never really peaceful to begin with, I want you to hear this. Your silence is not obligation. Speaking up for yourself is not betrayal. And sometimes the truth you're afraid to bring into the light is the only thing that can finally set everyone free, including the people who were so desperate to keep you quiet. If this story moved you, if you saw even a piece of your own life in mine, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe to Black Hope so you never miss the next story, because there are so many more truths like this one waiting to be told. And if somebody in your life needs to hear that their voice matters, send this video to them tonight. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.